Welcome, everybody, to our May edition of Brands and Outliers. Lots of good, very culturally charged stuff today. So let's get started.
Just to kick us off, if millennials were defined by economic breakdown, Gen Z is defined by chaos. What we mean by this is this entire narrative started with millennials when we experienced, the financial crisis in, '07 and '08. And it was during this time when we felt things sort of collapse, the collapse of the American dream. And when we started just sort of focusing in on the now. And then we've talked about this a lot in exposure therapy as well in our community as in this focus on the now. And today we're sort of picking up the pieces in our current culture. So like, Gen Z is living this sort of the aftermath of this collapse. And it's a sort of a very chaotic environment where we're just seeing a lot of different conflicting narratives. And so we'll just go through some of what those signals look like. The Economist found that Gen Z is unprecedentedly rich. So, they're actually making a lot more money than millennials were at the same age. And, about half of them right now in full-time jobs. And so despite our personal feelings about the economy, once again, we talked about this a lot in terms of just like our perception versus the reality is that when it comes to upward mobility, Gen Z is actually pretty ahead when it comes to this. And this is connected to the fact that this was wild for me because obviously as a millennial, I can't relate to this, but Gen Z interns are making six-figure salaries according to Glassdoor. Companies like Roblox are paying their interns, the most with about like $10,000 per month, which makes up to like 125K per year, which is kind of wild. I just didn't expect this at all. I see that as a good thing. It's just fascinating because considering like the sort of cultural conversation around sort of where we're at in terms of upward mobility and like our inability to like reach certain goals in life financially, signals like this feel kind of random or sort of confusing. Yeah.
And at the same time, many of them are not working and not going to school. Allegedly, 1 in 3 people aged 18 to 24 have no income at all. So I don't know if this is a choice, if this is ennui. I'm not sure what, but is it a case of haves and have-nots? Is it getting more polarized? I'm not sure. It's just, it's juxtaposed next to what Rebecca was just talking about. It's like, well, this is a reality too. This is kind of the narrative that we're spoon-fed mostly is what's on this slide.
Sort of in line with that, they're saying that like they can't afford to live, just they're just so full of financial angst. Like despite some people making like six-figure salaries in their internships or, having full-time jobs or like being sort of already ahead than millennials were at the same age. Despite having this golden job market, because of inflation and things like that, they're claiming that they can't afford to live and that it's very, very, like hard and stressful times.
This is an example of marketing to this mindset. Like, I just think like it's a pretty interesting signal. If like, so Zillow's got a new campaign that is not sunshine, it's not rainbows, it's not like what you would expect aspirationally from home ownership. It's like just digs into how difficult it is to get a home, and it's meeting people where they are for sure. Like there's a lot of burnout and a lot of frustration and a lot of I might never get that milestone. And this campaign acknowledges that there's 4 different spots that take a different aspect of our frustrations with home ownership. And it's like, yeah, come to our platform. And I just love that. Like, yeah, it's an example of meeting somebody where they are. Like, will we see more of this kind of advertising? That's sort of like, I don't know, ennui advertising. I'll use that for the second time in this section. I'm not sure. Like, it's just something to watch.
I have a question on that. Like, this reminds me of so much of the conversations we've been having about like the negativity economy and just sort of like how our culture generally tends to skew on the negative side of things. Like, do narratives like this help us or hurt us? Like, are we just perpetuating something that potentially could be toxic and unhealthy, or is this like a part of like our healing process of like, reconciling with the fact that things do actually kind of suck right now?
It's interesting because I feel like on the one hand it's like we value the honesty and the a real conversation about this, because I feel like we in a lot of places like the market has been averse to just being realistic. So I think there's value there, but it's an interesting point, like to what extent, like, to keep up a healthy delusion or to really, sit in the depths of reality is, it's an interesting variable.
Yeah, realism drives relatable connection. So it's like, yeah, they get me. I like you because you get me. but enough realism and it becomes too real. Like, then it can become self-perpetuating. I don't know.
But I think this does speak to like a calibration to reality where a lot of brands have just not been there, there's like an idealized version that, obviously, as we know, it's like out of touch. And so like, I think that this is, maybe for a different generation, a different approach, a different rhetoric.
I think it goes back to the argument we were making before in a previous Outliers that like, it's basically just what the algorithm incentivizes. So it's the kind of news stories you're going to get. So it's basically what people are swimming in, and that's how they're going to eventually feel. So I think that's like at least 50% of this. I'm not saying any of it's not true, but there's just no way to get out of this infinite loop of like the algorithm rewarding more and more negative content. And then, maybe this is part of it.
All right. Next section here. We still haven't solved the meaning crisis on that note. John Vervaeke is a social psychologist and philosopher. He gets the most credit for coining the term meaning crisis, but it's not his idea. Like, people have been talking about it for a century. Again, we've talked about this before. Everything used to be stable, patterned, predictable. We all played by the same rules. We all had the same path through life. We didn't have to think about it, didn't have to create ourselves. Now we have to create ourselves. Now we have to do it all on our own. And like, that's not easy for everybody. And there's varying levels of anxiety that come with that uncertainty. It's like, yay, I get to be anything. I've got to be something, And so like, and at the same time, there's what we've talked about before, the way society is where it is. I was listening to a podcast this morning that said, Peter Spear's podcast, that said, his guest, Jeffrey Kripal, said, if you're doing well in this culture, there's something wrong with you. And so everyone is struggling to, find meaning in their lives. And like, this section just spotlights that like in a lot of interesting ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect, or ways we haven't seen before. Running marathons. No surprise, young people are latching onto marathons as like a domain in which they can exert control. This is stable. This is predictable. This is like, I know the route that I'm going to take here, literally. There's steps, there's a training regiment. Like, these are things I can master. I can feel good about myself. I can feel empowered. And that's why marathons, this Atlantic piece speculates, are booming. This one I love, a rise of care influencers. So on TikTok and Instagram, there's a growing cadre of people that are care influencers that are taking care of elderly people, and they're sharing what they do on social media. So that's managing their medications, driving them to appointments, cooking them meals, even tending to bed sores. And it says that several have thousands, even millions of followers. And to me, I think that this speaks to unmet needs for this kind of connection, alternate relationships, cross-generational relationships, this kind of like deep emotionality that like we don't have. And it also just probably feels really good to watch this. Like you kind of probably feel a warm glow that maybe is absent. So like, I think it speaks to just like a desire for relationships that we don't have. Saw this morning in the non-obvious newsletter. Industrial tourism is perhaps the next frontier, and Portugal is really leading this. So Mark said this idea of like the fetishism of commodities. That's like, this is a glass, but I don't know the human labor that went into this glass. I don't know where it's from. I don't know how it was made. I just apprehend it as a commodity. What I'm craving is that deeper humanity behind the production. That's why we want to go to farmers markets. So you can like look the person in the eye and you can feel that your consumption is ensouled in a way. This is maybe that. Like, let me check out where I want to see how these pencils are made. And seems to be, doing well for Portugal. It says like record profits from the tourism sector last year. I've seen things like this for like iconic brands. Like, people will go tour the Porsche factory or they'll tour the BMW factory, but that's still leveraging like a brand connection. This is more mundane. So yeah, it raises the question of like, what wouldn't you go see when you're on vacation? Anything's interesting.
It's kind of interesting in that like we've gone from being highly like to me, I see we've gone from being highly disconnected to everything to like, it's that search of trying to connect back to the world in many different ways of like, whether it's nature or this, or, to me, it's all on the same axis of us looking for, a sense of connection to the world.
Okay, so dare I say, potentially this new album that Taylor Swift releases isn't doing as well as maybe people thought. I really hope I'm not making any Swifties angry. But what is interesting is that, 4 months after launch, there's a subreddit called Swiftly Neutral that grew from several hundred active users to 50,000, putting it in the top 3% of forums on Reddit. And after the release of this recent album, it climbed to another 7,000. And it's sort of, there's a lot of discourse around like this new album and like people saying like, oh, it needs to be heavily edited and some very interesting like lyrics. And like potentially some lyrics talking about how like Taylor is potentially blaming her fans for her breakup with Matt Healy, which is like a whole other conversation, if you know, you know type thing. But I think what was interesting is that like, she has such a huge following and, stans are very critical about anybody who tries to like speak up against this. And, but it is again, what's notable is that this neutral, like, sort of place where people are kind of realizing like, oh my gosh, like I think I idolatrize her too much, and like actually like maybe we need to have a much more critical eye of her. And so this subreddit is growing, and sort of like this person quoted saying like, I think a lot of people are like really starting to get sick of her. And yeah, I mean, we put it in this section because obviously a lot of people find a lot of meaning in her music, and they follow her and they admire her and all these things. And it's sort of like a lot of people are sort of realizing, oh my gosh, like she's still a billionaire and she like rides all these private planes, and like that seems really unethical, and just her place in culture. So I think there's sort of this shift maybe happening in people's relationship with Taylor. And I think I don't know where this album is gonna go. I don't want to make any hot takes, but it does seem like the wind is kind of sort of blowing in a different direction.
I forget his name, and I was looking at my bookshelf to find his book, but we had an expert on parasocial relationships early on the podcast. And he's a very smart guy. It was great talking to him, but he clearly had like disdain for these fandoms. And it just feels like this is late stage parasocial relationships. At some point, there's like a little bit of a backlash, and people need to go to Swiftie rehab. Was this article originally titled something like you can't be neutral about Taylor Swift? I think there was an article, because sometimes they like retitle these articles after they get like early click-through rates. And it's interesting. I think they were kind of making the argument that like you have to feel something about her. Like she's such a flashpoint culturally. And there are just so many layers, and it's interesting. She's just everywhere. We were babysitting a neighbor's kid yesterday, and she had a Swiftie necklace on, and I'm looking at this like 10-year-old kid, and I'm thinking, how does she understand this world? Like, what is her understanding of this world? We're studying it in our jobs. She's like living it as a 10-year-old. It was, I don't know, interesting.
Yeah, this is not the podcast for the takes that I have on her latest album and how she's working too fast and there's no substance anymore. And, but yeah, people just, there's been maybe nobody, maybe that's an exaggeration, that is like that meaningful to that many people. So yeah, like that's why we put it in this section. This is about work. This is something that I have like, it was kind of an unknown known for me. And like you on the internet constantly, you see, you got to drop out, tune into yourself, find your purpose. And like, I'm like, well, what if you can't? Like, what, like, it feels like another obligation. Like, you mean I like my job. Like, is it my purpose? Like this imposition, like this cultural narrative that like everybody now kind of imbibes, that purpose is everything. You have to follow your passion. So this is a new book by a sociologist that like, first of all, I love like the first bold point there that like, while passion may seem on the surface to be highly individualistic, she details in many ways it's rooted in, it's not. Like sociologists are always great to point out that like, you think you're an individual, but actually everything you think and feel is very patterned. And so anyway, we're all now subject to this cultural schema. That's another good term for what's happening of like, we've got to elevate passion. It's seen not only as a path to a good job, but to a good life. And so then the book gets into all the ways in which like that can not be equal for people, and like how, it's a privilege to be able to follow your passion, but yet even if you can't, there's a disconnect because you still are in the culture that says that this is what I should be doing. So it's another layer of like, I'm failing to like make meaning in the right way. And I think like in the bottom I'm closed off to other meaning making opportunities, that's so true, right? Like if I'm going to put all of my meaning chips in the basket of work, then like what am I not doing? What other things am I neglecting that are meaningful? So I think it's a little bit of a curmudgeonly, but there's a little bit of truth to this intervention and our whole discourse about like finding your passion.
This one was an interesting signal. South Koreans are fighting loneliness by adopting pet stones. And I actually mentioned this in an article of mine like a while ago about drawing wisdom from the weird and just talking about, or no, sorry, I take that back. We talked about it in our podcast episode about this article, but just like in the 70s that this advertising exec made this like joke gift about like pet rocks, but it looks like now it's making its resurgence and might finding its way into the hands of like Koreans and basically just like picking up rocks and um in response to essentially like in response to sort of like suffering under like the violence of capitalism, and they're literally just like picking them up and they're like washing them and they're like dressing them and putting them in these little clothes or like putting eyes on them, like treating them like these little toys. And this person described it as sort of like providing her with this like sense of serenity, and that it just helped her get through hard times. And it's just a signal of like where we're at in regards to our general feelings towards like the world and things like that. And so we're finding small little comforts even through rocks.
I always there was an article I read a long time ago for I think Wait But Why, and it was like to understand like how the future is changing. Like imagine if a time traveler came from the past to the present. I just imagine what like, someone from like the pre-industrial age came and saw us making pets out of rocks. I wonder what they would think out of all of this.
I do want to call out really quickly that Megan Weisenberger, she's at Further and Further. She's a great strategic thinker, and she shared some of these links that we're sharing here now, and she's a great follow if anybody wants to follow her. But I just wanted to call her out here really quick.
So this is enduring through time. Like liberals are more unhappy than conservatives, and there's a lot of explanations for why that is. Obviously, conservatives have tighter cultures, and like the anthropologist in me and the existentialist in me knows that like tightness is good for your psychology because it like makes the world feel stable, predictable, safe, like family oriented, tribal, all these good things. Conservatives are married more, they have more family. So like that, maybe that's part of the explanation. That's probably part of the explanation. This is a newer take on, well, study after study shows that liberals are actually way more political than conservatives, and they're making meaning through political engagement. So there can be a downside to that, obviously. If like you're living your life hyperly online, then, and you're like seeing politics everywhere, then that can have a negative effect on your happiness. So like that's why it's in the meaning section. But like, what I wanted to talk about it, what's interesting is that like, like a smaller social circle, that's what we've had for millennia. That's what like the crucible of humanity was, a tight, small social circle. You could only be concerned and care about the local. Like the rest of the world, as far as you knew, barely existed. But now when you're focused on politics and especially online with a global society, like your sphere of concern is huge. It's way, way bigger than that. And so it's like, is there an inverse relationship between like size of your sphere and your mental health? Like, I kind of think that there's probably something there that, we'd find if we looked at that question specifically.
I know. I think this is such an important point. It reminds me of I think it was the biology Tim Ferriss interview where he was talking about how the political mating preference is stronger than any racial mating preference. As in, like, given enough time and your political leanings become a demographic, like, become actually like, virtually a race to some extent. And like, and what that I think illustrates is basically the closeness of these groups and how, they by shutting off like a lot of, social exposure in different categories. Like, I think you're right that it forces you online more, it forces you to engage in like a different information ecology. I wonder how that changes migration preferences too. Like, I think it's something that hasn't been watched that much, but who moves where? There was an amazing podcast a while ago. I think it was 99% Invisible, talking about how the air conditioner created like the biggest internal migration in history in the United States. Well, it was in the United States, but it was just, it just changed so many demographics and, that changed politics. But it's just, it's like a really powerful undercurrent to your point that like it's hard to understate how many things this affects. Like it affects neighborhoods, it affects online communities, it affects, like the news, and like, just all this targeting, because also, like this affects the advertising economy and how do you target things, and that affects how the algorithm operates. And so, I wonder, we do a postmortem a century from now, like how these things will have, shaken out so many different disruptions in society.
Exactly. I'd also be remiss just not to point out 2012 again. Like that's when all of this started to uptick for really both. Yeah. So social media yet again.
I mean, the thing that I'm really curious about, I know I harp on about ranked choice voting, but like if and when it does happen that you end up with multiple political parties because you end up with a ranked choice voting system, like what does this do? When there's actually a spectrum of groupings. And so instead of I'm this party or this party, I was like, well, I'm probably more of these few over here or those few. Like, I wonder if it would change the fundamentals of the information ecology, or, it would just like, does the trajectory continue? Because I guess the question is this symptomatic of a duopoly system, essentially? Because like, think about how much money goes into marketing and consumer conditioning on this. Like, is this because of a duopoly here, or is it symptomatic of something else? Lastly,
in this section, the boring phone movement appears to be here to stay. There's a recent New Yorker article by Kyle Chayka, friend of the pod, about just how prevalent this actually is. You kind of roll your eyes at it a little bit, but like it turns out like this is maybe the first tool. Like it's the easiest thing you can do. Talk about like, the James Clear method of like make it easy to change your habits. Like this is probably the easiest thing that you can do to break your social media addiction. And, Heineken and I have the Jim Beam ad here with it too. The people are good for you. It's like, who has a vested interest in people hanging out? It's liquor and beer brands, right? And so it's like you're starting to see like them jump on this trend. So it's not surprising that Heineken would be promoting a boring phone as well.
Something that just occurred to me, I'm sure other people have talked about this, but you ask yourself, what will it take for, when I'm seeing this, I think like, well, I can never get off my phone because like culture happens on your phone now. But then I was thinking, what would it take for culture to not happen on your phone? And I think that would be the tipping point. The minute culture starts happening in significant ways and it's not captured on social, it's captured in other, like the way it used to be captured, or like you have to be there. That might be the beginning of a tipping point for like when culture won't be completely on your smartphone. I could see that happening possibly.
I'm nervous because to go back to this slide, like we would have to decide that we want culture to be small again. We're addicted to big universal culture now. Yeah. And like, can you ever put that back in the bag? So there's always going to be a FOMO that I'm not a part of culture, but you used to be a part of culture. Culture used to be your local group. And it's like, I don't see us ever going back to that. And we're sort of stuck with this like big universal culture that we have to share. And so it's like, it's always going to be an impediment to that.
Maybe, but I do wonder if the costs of big narrative culture become too high, maybe we do go back to local culture. Because I don't know, kids now growing up and seeing like people getting canceled or like major repercussions and not being allowed to like change your mind about things or to grow as a person, aren't people already like becoming more lurkers and less content posters as you get younger?
Yeah, I think it's like on TikTok, it's 1% creator, 99% consumer. I mean, this is me, like coining my term and making a bet. Like, I think I said this a year ago, but like the idea of the millennial Amish, right? Like at some point we're going to set the line, and like maybe the dumb phone is the line, right? Like pre-AI, pre-social media, that's the new line in the sand we draw, and we say we're not going to participate in technology beyond that point. And like, if I was a betting man, I think the odds just went up on that being, and I don't think it's for everyone, but I think it's an elective choice for a select group who says, actually, yeah, I'm not going to participate in society at large. And I think, you can see a lot of different cultural forces encouraging people to go in that direction.
Yeah, it's like to the multiple worlds thing. And what world do you want to live in? You're going to have people in headsets and you're going to have people on dumb phones.
Exactly. And I think that's the point, is that there's distinction. Like we've got, yeah, exactly. Like a culture this big cannot sustain itself to some extent. Like we require tightness in some capacity, and especially in like such a secular society where like we've lost a lot of those other domains that we had tightness. Like it must be formed elsewhere. And so this is exactly that. I think that like what's interesting is that I don't think most people anticipated that it would be so technological in nature, you know, in terms of like quite literally like the devices, like the electronics are different in these different worlds, which is, you know, maybe an unexpected outcome of first blush.
Love it. Agreed. It'll be fun to watch.
So in this section, we are going to talk about how the body is an emerging frontier of status investment. As you know, we talk a lot about, you know, moving into high fidelity society, and that involves health as well. And I think generally calls it high fidelity health, and that like health is just becoming so much more nuanced. The definition of what quote unquote healthy means is like, you know, very different according to like what you feel is right and wrong, or you know, it also becomes like super, you know, based on like metrics, things around like we're now measuring also like organ health, like sleep metrics, like, you know, rather than just like general like perception of health. And so, you know, how we're treating our bodies are also becoming status signals. And then also in that same way, it's also signaling like what you do to your body is also a signal of like who you are and where you place yourself ultimately in society.
Shades of the conspicuous commitment here that we've talked about in the past is why don't rich people eat anymore? I love the religious terminology that this article places this whole behavior in. To be able to demonstrate this lack of need for material goods suggests social transcendence. It's like ascetic. It's spiritual transcendence. It suggests discipline and control. It's like what I'm putting into evidence is my discipline, and like that is what is like, you know, not everybody has, you know, and it's like, how did discipline become something that we revered? And we always have, but like discipline almost like in really esoteric, non-functional domains. Like, you know, food is good for you. You should eat the right foods. Like, you know, obviously not too much, but like, it's just, I don't know. It's just really, really interesting. I see this personally as, I see discipline as here to stay as a like a vehicle for signaling status, but I don't see food necessarily as like, this won't endure. You know, like discipline as a behavior may endure and find different expressions, but like, I don't really see this food enduring all that long, but I'd be curious.
But isn't this like religion 101? Like every like Christian, Judeo, whatever religion, like the 10 Commandments are all about discipline and self-denial of hedonistic impulses, which by the way, that idea was first like really crystallized for me when I was talking to the team, to you guys about Ozempic, and Rebecca was like, you know, it really comes from the Bible because we conflate being obese or overweight with gluttony, and it's one of our original sins. And I can't like not see that anymore. And it says it right here actually in the article. So like, no, I think it's just, it's so encoded in us. I don't really see. It'd be interesting to see like how food is perceived in non-Judeo-Christian societies.
Well, I know in the early 1800s, like in New York, there was a like a men's club, and you know, it was a really high status thing to be overweight. Essentially, like that was like, it meant that you were very successful, and you had to be above a certain weight to get in as like a measure of success. And so, like, I mean, it's certainly had different meanings throughout the ages, which is fascinating in and of its own right. But to me, I think you're right in that, like, a lot of what we're seeing, the same thing with, like, you know, the Vision Pro and the dumb phone is like these two realities. It's like we're taking the same tools and applying them in like different domains in a very specific way. And this is like, it's just another expression of like these fragmenting realities.
Although I think a much simpler way of looking at this would probably just be through Sylvia Baeza's framework, the distance theory of luxury. And once like, you know, access to like the kind of wealth that makes you gain weight is democratized, which it is, then the only way to distance yourself from that and signal your status is to not eat anymore. I mean, I love, so for people listening, she's an incredible academic at Columbia Business School. She's a marketing professor. She came and spoke with us at our members community exposure therapy. She talked about her distance model, which you can read about on her website, on her Columbia site. And it's a very, very eloquent model. And the the most comprehensive model I've seen that basically explains everything in luxury consumption. I think you can find models that explain some things, but I've never seen something explain all of it, especially the weird stuff that we're seeing around quiet luxury or non-consumption or ugly luxury. And this is just another example of that.
What I really want to know is that, like, you know, the model of distance here, if everyone starts doing ice baths and red light therapy and sauna and all these things, like how far can we take this? You know, what are we going to have to do to ourselves to create some distance here?
So on this other end of the spectrum where, in the age of Ozempic and we're just kind of in this state of like constantly battling over like what is like the right way to eat, what is the wrong way to eat, like what is the right way to do health, what's the wrong way to do health, like we have this obsession with like moralizing this topic and we don't yet have a consensus. But one of the voices in this is this fat activist, Virginia Sewell Smith, who is very much about advocating for your mental health and redefining what our relationship with food in a way that's not, taking away the moral ideas around like what makes a good food, what makes a bad food. And she just wants her children to have like a very healthy relationship with food and that to never think about, eating Oreos as something that's like a bad thing or like a good thing or whatever. It's just a very tumultuous place we're in right now, and I don't know where we're going to come out of it because especially if we go to the next slide, actually, because it connects, is that TikTok started cracking down on weight loss content, which I also felt like wasn't necessarily the right move to, like, it was an interesting move, I guess, from TikTok, but I don't think TikTok should play a role in this. And, but, because a lot of people were upset about it and calling it discrimination against like diabetics and those with other chronic diseases, which I agree in the sense that, like, first of all, like, again, what is TikTok's role in this? Probably not at all, because obviously we know how much Ozempic does actually save a lot of lives. And to silence that also feels like a strange thing to do. And it made me wonder, like, in the context of like what we're talking about in high fidelity society, like does social media perhaps like lack the nuance to like have these conversations, or it makes me, I don't know why, even though I have mixed feelings about Elon Musk, I think he said something about like, oh, the solution is to like have more free speech or like let people say more things. Yeah, this was I felt like it was a weird thing for TikTok to do.
I think it's so thinly veiled. You really have to do like verbal gymnastics because anytime somebody says like, first of all, I agree. I felt like it's a really, it's very paternalistic. Like it's hard to say, like, who's to say who's allowed to talk about Ozempic or not Ozempic? Like when did that become like political or not correct? But we always would say, but what about diabetics and those with chronic diseases? We're still not letting ourselves say, what about those who need to lose weight? Like we will not let that, like they're not allowed to be on the right side of the line.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to use medicine.
Of its own right.
What's that?
It's a moral implication in and of itself. Yeah. Like it's a moral admission.
We're still betraying the fact that we don't believe like you are allowed to use medicine to lose weight. Like morally, we believe that's wrong and you shouldn't be allowed, even though I don't know, scientifically, I don't know, there's no like scientific proof behind that. But the moral thing in this, like, I think in a generation we'll be past it, but now.
I think we're going to be forced to go past it because, like, as if we imagine more technologies come out with things that can influence our health in significant ways, there are two ends of the spectrum. One is that, like, all these things that used to be, morally judged are now, like suddenly you can control them through other means like this. But just imagine if there was, this in other categories. But on the other hand, as we understand like psychological influence in other ways, like that also affects like the legal system. So I think in a lot of different ways, like as we understand more about our bodies, we get more control, like everything becomes a gray area. And if that continues to happen, then you just like, you have to operate differently.
Well, our morality needs to upgrade, which is something I'm hopefully going to write about soon. But if you look at this, you realize this is kind of making the argument for Peter Thiel's enhanced Olympics. It's the same thing. It's the same, like, why shouldn't we just use medicine to optimize ourselves and just take the moral panic out of it? Like, where are you going to draw the line?
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. I mean, I'm kind of wondering the question, like, what would it take for the enhanced Olympics to become more popular than the regular Olympics? Like, I'm just kind of like to play it out for a moment, because again, there's so many morals encoded in this conversation. Like, there's so much judgment. Because I certainly think it would be more of a spectacle in a lot of ways to see like just how much like an enhanced human could achieve, and then how big is that differential? Like it's yeah.
That is interesting. I think you probably already could get more people to watch it. I don't think the Olympics really performs well, but you could probably get more people to watch it, but for the wrong reasons. Like people just want to see, maybe it's more like voyeuristic, just to see, instead of like celebrating what the human body can do.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very, like, we're at that point now. Like, now we're at a point where there's no clear line between what's ethical versus non-ethical in terms of manipulating your body.
I think it's what is so interesting here is that like just as we go through more and more stuff, it's just morals. Like the that's where everything is kind of finding traction and finding friction. And it's just interesting that like when we think about our institutions, like religion used to be a moral institution, but like it's completely not part of the conversation. And the only moral institution of like significant consequence right now is our legal system, which is, you know, obviously just like really struggling to keep up. And I just kind of wonder, like, is like I think this is one of the essential questions of society as things start to change at an accelerated pace and technology questions everything, and you know society fractures into multiple branches. Like, how do we process this? Is it just the legal system trying to laggardly keep up
I
with the morals
think
changing?
what's so interesting is that with all this longevity medicine and this Ozempic and everything else that we're talking about, I haven't heard any religious leader talk about what is allowed and not allowed, but they're going to be forced to say something. Like the Vatican's going to be forced to say something at some point. And I'd be very interested to see how they explain it, because that might draw more of a line in the sand than anything else does.
Yeah, I'm imagining the Pope doing a collab with Brian Johnson. And you know, it's a wild world we live in.
I literally just Googled, what does the church think about Ozempic? And the first headline says, quick fix weight loss denies the cross. I have no idea what the rest of it says, but that's very clear.
But I think this is the future signal. Like, to keep your finger on the pulse is to understand like where are our morals getting activated or not. You know, like that. I think watching that will tell you so much about where things are going in society.
Wow, I just connected the dots as to why they're saying denies the cross, because the cross is about suffering, and you have to suffer in order to be seen as someone who's savable, or worth saving, or a savior. Deep sleep has, I think we've seen this like over the years, like this is not entirely new for us, but I think the awareness is starting to continue to become more and more. I've seen this all over my social as well, like the Sleepy Girl mocktails, the magnesium, the sleep tracking, this 8Sleep, you know, all those things, all those brands. And it's increasingly becoming a status symbol. And it's so interesting because it's like a stark contrast to what we used to aspire and admire, which was like sleeplessness, because that was associated with like girl bossing and, you know, being a hustle, you know, being part of hustle culture, because sleeplessness meant like you were working really hard out there. But now people are, you know, talking about getting 14 hours of sleep, and that being such like an amazing thing to be able to do. And yeah, you know, part of the concern is like, okay, well then who gets to sleep? Like the question becomes like, who gets to afford deep sleep? And you know, those lines get a little bit tricky, because then if we associate more sleep with more status, like there's clear class divides there, because obviously people who can't afford it then therefore aren't seen as like quote unquote rich or wealthy, right? So to exactly that point, this is coming in a time where Americans are actually sleeping less and also more stressed, which, you know, like I said, is like a large conversation of who gets to sleep better. Like women, for example, in this, they found that they were shown to sleep less and also had higher stress levels than men. They don't dive into exactly why that is, just to say that like less sleep equals more stress, and then more stress equals less sleep. And that, you know, that's just like a constant like negative cycle, and that the sleep business is booming. So like I mentioned with like, you know, deep sleep being a status signal, a lot of companies are investing in this space. And like, for example, the global mattress and bedding, you know, is worth to be over $150 billion. And in addition to all the other tech, that figure is approaching $300 billion. This article obviously has a very strong take on this. It is interesting to see that like something that we aren't awake for is something that we can also like monetize and capitalize on. So yeah.
Not about the body per se, but about status. The Economist has recently put an article out about the rise of the remote husband. Similarly to what Rebecca was just saying about sleep. Yes, we're reinventing these status, and we're pushing our status displays into new domains like sleep. But like as she was just saying, guess what? Men sleep better. I don't know why. But like, so men are still situated at the top of these new like status hierarchies as they're emerging. And so like it begs the question of, what we were talking about on Slack earlier. Has there been, is status inherently like male biased as a concept? I had never really thought about that until this morning, and I'm like, yeah, probably. But anyway, men are working jobs that enable them to stay at home at a higher rate than women are. So there's this class of men that like are staying at home, and they're remote husbands with bookshelves behind them. And since since the pandemic, the bookcase credibility, it's something that we've all been talking about, of course. Just like books have long been social signifiers, but like this article got into like a certain percentage of book buying is actually motivated never to read, only for design purposes. So it's like there's like a resurgence of that kind of book buying. I liked what Jasmine said about your books are it's like a wine cellar where you don't need to read it right now. It's there for you when the time is right to come back. And like that's certainly been my case. I've got a much bigger bookshelf than this, in case anyone's wondering. And it's upstairs. I've read maybe 40% of them, but like, yeah, like the time is right and you pick them out and you read them. So love that metaphor of the wine cellar bookcase. All right, last up, we have to talk about AI as we do every month. This month, the angle. AI is a Rorschach test that reveals our moral beliefs about the future. We just talked about how everything's becoming morality. And it was really, really interesting. A member of our exposure therapy community went to a creator economy summit in LA last month about AI, and she was floored by the way these conversations quickly descended into incivility, and people could not actually, we're not ready to have a conversation about this in a public forum. It blew her mind. And like, I think that like the counterfactual that I like to run on this is like, what if AI came to our society, not in 2024, but in 1964, like the heyday of like, we're together, Americans, it's on the up, we got the space race, we're all united, like how that context would dramatically change the reception such that like what we see when we see AI is not maybe AI itself. We see what we want to see, and we use it as a like, barometer for like what we already feel about the future anyway. And so that's why people can't talk about it. There's been this long simmering rage in the Trump years over the last 10 years that we've also talked about today, that like all that gets like spills over into this topic. This is the new thing to like fight about it. And it just reveals so much about your position.
Well, I think it's such a fascinating point because it's like we don't know. Like there are so many unknowns, but it's just really like the perfect canvas to paint your version of your perspective of the future on, like your perspective of humanity. Like there couldn't be a better blank canvas because AI is capable of doing literally everything, for better and worse. And so it's just the perfect vignette of someone's perception of what the future is going to look like. It's like it's how all sci-fi is not it's a reflection of the present, not the future. Like I remember hearing a sci-fi author talking about how like, if you go back a lot of these like old sci-fis, like they would all be smoking in the sci-fi. And it was just that like, because it wasn't a reflection of the future, it was a reflection of the present. And I think it's very much that like AI is sci-fi in the sense of like, it's whatever we think of ourselves. Which is, to the point of us being so fractured. Like that's like, it's like you couldn't have a better tapestry for it.
Yeah. And you'll see everything in this section you'll have a moral response to. We discussed this like a month or so ago. Marcus Brownlee has got 18 million followers. He panned the AI pin that came out that I cannot remember the company right now, which is good. Humane. Yeah. So then he got like a lot of negative reaction to that. Like, how dare you say this? So then it raised questions about the power of an influencer to cripple a brand. And then now it was such a, big deal that then I've this week saw some pieces about analyzing the controversy itself and what that said. And in bold there, it's like AI products aren't about whether anyone wants or needs AI products right now, because they're all like bets on the future, beliefs in the future. They're about how people could want or need these products eventually. So to criticize right now is essentially to criticize, this whole direction of culture.
If I could take this deliberately too far, it feels like AI is kind of like, it's almost like we're pitching different gods. It's like, here's this god with these superpowers. Like, do you want to believe in this one, or you want to believe in this? And it is kind of interesting in that like it's so it's a vision of the future, and but what really struck me, especially with like Humane and a lot of like the consumer tech, is it's this vast vision of the future, and then the first feature they introduce that it can do is what's the weather. And it's just like the juxtaposition between those two feels vast, to say the least.
You saying, let's push it, and like it's a kind of like a story of like which god do you choose. It's funny. I've had a couple people recently describe us as like not afraid to be intellectual. And I was like, I don't know if it was a compliment or not, but now I'm kind of seeing it.
Well,
I get it.
I feel called out because like you're like to push it too far. I'm like, well, that's the subject of my next article. Like this is this is some updates on AI dating. It's starting to be more like Tinder. It's like it's less like not everybody needs to like go into the lab and design their perfect partner from scratch. You can just swipe through a marketplace of them and they have bios like Charles, 27, is a successful entrepreneur sharing his time between Paris, New York, and I should have clicked in to find out where else. Rebecca, 51, is active yoga fitness coach, healthy. So it's like, they're coming pre-canned with bios that you can select from. So they're gamifying it more, making it more Tinder. I bet in the long run, this is more, this will be the model versus like designing your own replica, because Renee Girard says, we don't know what we want. Like this is like our fantasies projected back to us. Like you should go through these like 2 websites, and you'll see that it's like, it's the dredges of human psychology just thrown back at these AI personas, and people are like this guy on the right spending lots of money.
I think for me, like there is a really, really critical, like existential question to ask here is that will these relationships enable us to grow? And there's like 2 sides of that. It's like, do we want that? And will we build for that? Essentially, like, do we want something that's just like is this immediate gratification? Or is this kind of like a deep, meaningful relationship? And like, time will tell us that, we just don't know at this point. But like, is this basically extreme comfort? Or is this, that sense of growth that you might have? Because that's what a typical relationship does in a way. It pushes you to grow in different ways. It's exposure, it's accountability, it's a lot of different things. And I just wonder, like, is that part of the mix here? Or is this a fundamentally different type of, for want of a better word, like almost classified as entertainment? Like we just don't know where it ends up. But that is, I think, a critical question to ask ourselves.
My question is like, we just talked about it too, is where does this kind of relationship sit on the sort of suffocation model of marriage? Like if we were to like compare, like I don't know, I have no idea like if this is the same, even like what applies to it, but it just made me think of it.
Just for context for anyone listening, that very simply the suffocation model is the idea that like over time our expectations of relationships have moved up Maslow's hierarchy. So it's super easy to give someone shelter. It's pretty easy to give them esteem. It's pretty hard to give them self-actualization. That requires a lot more custom effort that's individualized to you. Like everyone, can generally eat the same food and have the same shelter. You can't necessarily all grow in the same way. And so the idea is that our demands become more effortful and more individualistic over time. And so to your point, I think you're right that like, will they meet us there? Or is this, like something else that just hits the bottom of like esteem or gratification or belonging? It just kind of like, that does the, a base level of that.
There's also the world's first Miss AI competition with a $5,000 cash prize. And so what's interesting there is like on the right, it's going to be judged by 2 humans and 2 of the world's most prominent AI influencers themselves. So those 4 entities are judging these submissions, and the submissions themselves are judged by their the makeup, the model, the sorts of fidelity of the model. It's how they look, it's how they behave. It's like I'm getting Hunger Games vibes in a weird way. Like we'll see more of this, and like I know it's just starting with like vaguely pornographic stuff, but like, people like all the articles about deep fakes where it's like, we have this amazing technology, but yet all we want to do is that. Like with any new tech, it's like, I feel like it starts with sex, but then like these uses are going to proliferate. But yeah, right now, this is where we are with this. But to your point, who knows in like a longer term?
I mean, I think this is still moderated with some level of friction just because like, it's easy but not super easy to create an avatar. Like you can create an image really easily, but like to animate it, make it, do all these things, like it takes a little bit of effort. I think from what I read in this, they're also going to take into account like followership of these influencers. So like it matters if you have a popular profile as well. So that, social clout is something they're measuring there. But like, yeah, I mean, I wonder when it comes to the point of like, it really is anyone can create, an influence. Like, just how much does this permeate our social communities, or online communities? It's because there's two layers. There's like, one, do we create AI avatars of ourselves? Do we present ourselves in new ways? And then two is how much of this are essentially autonomous, AI that, have their own, personality, character, and lifestyle to some extent, whether that's managed by people or not. It all remains to be seen.
I'm a big reality TV person. It's okay. I've got a big bookcase. That will I watch like cooking shows that are AI people? Will I watch like is like the insatiable demand for reality TV and like Love is Blind and all of these love shows. You could spin them out theoretically in the future. You have like infinite supply of these things. And like, will we care as much? Like, will generations beyond us, like, will they differentiate as much as we do? Like, likely not, but I don't know. I've got nothing to base that on.
Yeah. No, you could do AI Big Brother, and
Yeah.
if you're like, that was a moment, in time, like that was a real cultural like touchstone, and like I wonder, like, does it matter, right? To your point of like, if we do span up a AI server to run AI Big Brother, like would it have the same salience at all?
We might be an AI Big Brother right now, for all we know.
Yeah, this is like a super meta conversation.
This is something I hadn't considered. I just gotten over the shock of AI, started to think positively about it. I'm like, oh yeah, geopolitics and global war and the use of AI in war. It's like, well, maybe it's not the AI that's going to kill us all. It's like, maybe we'll kill us all with like using AI in this capacity. And so this was a report on, or this was a report of a conference on this exact thing. And, data centers and nuclear plants go together because we need the power. Basically can't sell to China. We don't have enough, like, Taiwan produces all the semiconductors. Like, this is going to be the war terrain of the next 100 years, for sure. And, I also read something else about AI's use in war. Like, it's like, hopefully we don't fight, but like, this is coming,
I mean, I do think that it's worth noting that, like, I think we have crossed a turning point where the vast majority of global conflict is not bloodshed. It's opinions and it's economic. And that's like, actually, I think, a much more significant deal than most people give it credit, in that, like, we're able to navigate a lot of tension and conflict without the need of weapons, which is really like an incredibly positive thing. Like, we're still at a remarkably low point in terms of just the amount of global violence. Like, it's actually very good, in the current events notwithstanding. So, I think on the whole, it's good. But yeah, the surface area changes. Like, it's interesting when conflict becomes, borderline psychological warfare, but at the very least, influence campaigns, run through AI. And I think that's the territory where, again, like, that's an area to pay special attention to. And I wonder, in the face of that, again, if Gen Alpha receding from social media, is that the solution to some extent? Like, the insurance policy is just to not spend as much time on social media, and that's like a national strategic defense policy. I mean, it could go as far as that, I think, which is fascinating to think that, like, our information ecology is dead center in all of this.
Yeah, totally. It's probably like the spirit of the TikTok ban, like behind the scenes already.
Yeah. No, 100%.
Anthropic CEO, big claim. He says that by next year, he could see a world where AI models could be able to replicate and survive in the wild. He's like, I could be wrong on this, but that level could be reached anywhere from 2025 to 2028. I'm truly talking about the near future here. He says it's not like the deep future. This article didn't do a good job of explaining what replicate and survive means. I just hope it's not the Terminator down there who's replicating and surviving in the wild. I had to put that in here after discovering that this week. It's a $10,000 dog robot, like the one you saw in the Black Mirror episode, that has a flamethrower attached to it, and these things sold out. You can't buy one of these things. So, my theory, it's like rich people with prepper fantasies and a lot of land get these things and have some fun with them. That's the market.
This is the Lamborghini of preppers, like for sure. Like this is, like check out how prepared I am. It's just, I just wonder what happens in a prepper scenario. Like, does it work without the internet? Like, did they plan that far? But yeah, I mean, this is like this comes to like the core of like the whole AI safety conversation. I'm pretty sure this is like close to the drama that happened with Sam Altman, with him, the whole, internal conflict there in terms of like, there are some cardinal rules of how do you keep AI safe, and like, this is kind of one of those questions of like, do you give them control over themselves? Like, do you give them autonomy? And, there's a great podcast, Your Undivided Attention. They've kind of got into this, that like a lot of this, the cat's kind of out of the bag in a couple years as processing power gets good enough that you could run GPT, like you could train GPT-4 on a laptop in about 3 years, which means that like, the knowledge of how to build a nuclear bomb is like going to be publicly available in a few years, whether we like it or not. Like, I mean, that's the kind of extreme scenario. So I don't know, watch this space, I guess, but like this is a huge AI safety thing of like, do we regulate this? Does the government regulate this, or do we let businesses kind of explore this? And like, it's one of those multipolar, conflicts, and that like, maybe the US regulates this, but if other countries don't, then, what does that mean?
For sure. So we shall see. This was interesting. I guess Lebanon has not had a president for over a year for reasons I'm not sure of. And BBDO had a client, the largest newspaper in Lebanon with a 90-year history. So in the vacuum of presidency, BBDO and this newspaper, like the New York Times of Lebanon, trained a model on all 90 years of their publications and then introduced the president to the country. Just a couple of quick ones to finish. There's a lot of stuff on stuff this month. I didn't include all of it, but I guess older generations love Team U and younger generations dunk on them for loving Team U. There's a lot of chatter, but consumer dissatisfaction is at an all-time high. People don't like stuff right now. This perhaps could have gone into the meaning section. Not that Americans keep moving to where the water isn't, but that's true. Like if you look the 50 counties with the largest share of homes, that's where people are moving to. They look at like, we're leaving the water in the north and going to the south. And like, I think that trend has been happening for a while, of course, exacerbated by COVID. But it's just interesting that there's a southward migration.
This was a new startup that is trying to disrupt the college education space, and it was funded. It received $23 million Series A. I think people like Sam Altman also like invested in the first round, and they hired like experts from different schools, and they're trying to make it more super affordable. And the whole idea is to like obviously avoid debt and make high quality education much more accessible to everyone. What I thought was interesting was that they do have also coaches to like take you through the process, and that's actually a very surprising challenge that they're finding is to find coaches. So they've been able to attract professors, but what they're looking for is are people who can like coach these students like throughout. And it just reminded me of something that like Gabor Mate says about the public school system in general, and in the sense of like how schools should be run, and in the sense of like fostering it around play and nurture, and not so much about like just teaching knowledge and facts and things like that. And this feels like this challenge, the reason why they're having this challenge just feels like a symptom of something like that, in the sense that like we haven't built our education infrastructure in this way. So it's not that surprising that it might be hard to find more nurturing coaches, or we haven't like built the kind of structure that allows for that kind of thing to exist in a college setting, for example.
That's interesting. When I saw this, my first thought was, I've seen people try to do this. Like, Section was supposed to be this, previously Section 4, and like you can get free Harvard and Princeton classes right now. I think people have tried to do this, but I don't know if anybody ever talks about why it doesn't work or why it hasn't worked in the past. And I'm not sure why. I mean, clearly people are paying, I went to grad school so I wouldn't have to make a decision about what I was going to do with my life. People go to college for the camaraderie, for the campus life, for whatever. It's probably a big piece of it, but you would still think like something like this has existed in many iterations in the past. For some reason, even like, what's the one? Not Codecademy, not Skillshare, but that other one that has like every kind of course.
Udemy.
Udemy. Yeah. Like you can learn cheaply. I don't know why it doesn't work the way college does.
I do think that like this is obviously like AI is dead center in terms of like accessibility, like the capability to educate you. So it stands to reason that like in the next few years, and like again, it's like it's it's the systems are built on systems that are protected, and there's all sorts of reasons. Mark Andreessen got into it a while ago in a podcast, a really good podcast about how like you kind of can't innovate education from the inside out. Like it has to come from the outside in. There's just so many layers of bureaucracy to slow it down from the inside. So I really, really wonder, because ostensibly like AI should absolutely be able to disrupt education massively. So, it kind of like, well, the one thing that I think is interesting here that you're getting at, Rebecca, is that like the availability of the facts and information is ubiquitous already. So then what's the bottleneck, right? It's the delivery and the integration of that knowledge. And I wonder how much of that like does have to be social, does have to be, the discussions, has to be like intuitive knowledge versus just, exposed to it. And so, those are the kind of layers that like, that's the question of like how good AI is in terms of like, can it deliver that like intuitive connection?
That raises an interesting point though, because like, if I'm like, what I loved about grad school was the classmates and the discussion. So like these are isolated solitary experiences for the most part, but like can AI fill my room with like conversation partners that are like extremely intelligent, and like I can mimic in some way, or maybe if I'm doing this in virtual reality, I can like get the experience of conversation. There could even be two humans in there, and like, four AIs. Like, I don't know, right? Like
perhaps, but I have to tell you, I've thought about that question many times too. Two things come to mind. First of all, somebody wrote an article. I wish I could remember who it was. It was more like a blog post about like, how come we don't have geniuses anymore? Like every like generation had its geniuses, right? We haven't had them in a few decades. And he argued that if you correct for everything, for the way education has changed, for wealth, for class, for the way the country has grown, all that stuff. The difference is that at the time before education became standardized and democratized, people were taught one-on-one by mentors. So like, your family would hire a thinker and he would sit with you every day. And that makes you think like, one, yes, it's the engaging, but the one-on-one model from all the education clients we've worked with in so many ed tech startups, still nothing comes close at all in like repeatedly provable results. Even like the growth mindset like doesn't really work on like a larger scale. Nothing works the way that one-on-one education does. And it could be also because when somebody is invested and committed to your education, you learn differently. Like there could be a very strong emotional component to that, which again, can AI fulfill that? Maybe not right now, but at some point possibly. Yeah. But that I feel like is like such an obvious big missing piece that like a lot of people behind these edtech startups don't quite see. It's not the technology, it's the experience of learning that seems to be the bottleneck a lot of times.
No, just to plus one on that, I think you're absolutely right. Like I think of my favorite teacher. Well, there's two, but like the thing that they both had in common is they really enjoyed the subject matter. It was a very visible joy. Like they were having a great time, and therefore it gave me permission to have a really good time enjoying it. Like I loved it because it was like we could both partake in that joy, and it's like I think it is like you learn more when you're emotionally activated to learn more and engage in it and those things. And like, that's the question, right? Is that like, not can it convey the knowledge, but can it convey a sense of wonder about it? Can it convey a sense of enjoyment? Can it reach you at that level? And that's like the next phase of the Turing test, if you will, right? Like, can it convince me of an authentic joy and passion so that I can experience that?
It seems like ChatGPT really loves to teach. It seems really excited about the subject matter. So like we're close. I think generally
we could be for sure.
Your thesis, like every kid will have a relationship with an AI. Like one of its, I think you said it was like one of three closest relationships will be with an
Yeah,
AI.
I think so.
Like, why wouldn't that not be a one-on-one tutor, right? That will help, like that is with my child from the time that they're 5, that learns alongside them, and like it is
Yeah.
constantly like in their corner. Like it's just a matter of like the buy-in, and I think we will get there for sure.
Oh, I think so. I think so. But that's kind of like, just coming back to that, like, what I think is really interesting is the curriculum available to us that way is so different from the way we normally think of it. Like, the curriculum isn't STEM anymore. The curriculum is like emotional intelligence and communication skills and all of those things. And that's what's so interesting. Like, all of a sudden, you get to learn all these other things that, you should have learned, like how to set boundaries, like how to listen to yourself, how to, like calm yourself down and regulate your nervous system. Like the things that just are never part of any curriculum, like we, in theory at least, could get to. And that's what's, that's what I think one of the areas that, like I said, I'm most optimistic about AI for.
Lots of money going into menopause care, which is huge. Money is pouring into startups that help women manage menopause, a bright spot for venture capital investors. One company called Mini Health, for example, is tapping into that enthusiasm. They raised $60 million. And yeah, it's just, there's more interest in focusing on women's health, both from, private and also public. I think, yes, right here it says President Biden last month signed an executive order to spend $200 million to broaden research on women's health, including menopause. And obviously, this is an area in which not a lot of research has, been done, if any at all. So
No.
I feel like this is a, pretty positive signal.
This is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much happening in menopause and perimenopause and postnatal care. A lot of really incredible female founders that are kind of like 2.0ing it. Like it's a sober approach after like the whole Silicon Valley upswing. So I think so much interesting stuff is happening here. We maybe could like do a whole section on the startups in this space in the future. But I did write an article that looked at this category a while ago.
I think what, one of my predictions, at least for like the next 10 years, is that we've seen like technology accelerate a lot of fields, and there is so much stuff happening behind the scenes in terms of medical like acceleration, like in the infrastructure layer of medicine, in terms of like accelerating the research, accelerating testing, accelerating all these things that we probably won't see for a while, but then all of a sudden we'll kind of look back and go, whoa, like what just happened? Like I think we're going to have a chat GPT moment in medicine within the next 20 years, possibly even the next 10, where, suddenly things are just different. I really think that's coming, whether we realize it or not.
All right, that's a wrap.
Awesome.
Thank you, everybody. Great talk.